Right, hey guys, how are we doing? Back into the video from Super Airpatch Wolf, and we are finally getting round to the videos I said I would check out like a year ago. This is what the internet did to Garfield. So originally with long videos like this, I used to put them off because I would have to spend a long time editing and stuff. Like I would have to resync the audio every 12 minutes. I'd have to wait for it to render 12 minutes, boom, and then wait for it to render again, boom. This time, as if like, this year I've got a new setup and I don't have to do things like that anymore. It's quite simple. I can even pause and talk over the video, you know, and discuss it in between. It's cool. So yes, we're going to get this. I'm going to do this one and then we're going to go for Chainsaw Man as a Masterpiece and then we're going to watch Why You Should Still Read Berserk. So we'll get around to them. I apologize. I know you guys have been asking for ages for this one, but we're here. We're finally here. So, yeah, let's find out what the internet did to Garfield.
Garfield is a daily newspaper comic strip starring the iconic orange cat of the same name,
Doesn't like Mondays.
as well as his owner, John Arbuckle. Relatable, surly, and adorable.
Okay, this is gonna be a weird
Garfield
video.
was based off
There
the
you are. He
childhood
hates
memories
Mondays.
of his creator, Jim Davis. And in the 40
What
years
the hell's
since we first
going
met
on?
this lasagna-loving rascal, Garfield has become a global phenomenon, with
Yes.
yearly merchandising sales of
Whoa.
an estimated...
Oh, creeps out, man.
I've been covering fandoms for a
Oh my god, I'm so creeped out. This is so weird. Ugh.
little while now. And what I enjoy about doing this is how when you stare at a fandom long enough,
Yeah.
you begin to get this very distorted yet very honest reflection of its source material.
Okay.
The heart of The Simpsons, the descent of Sonic, the magnitude of Undertale. But then there's Garfield.
Yeah.
Believe me when I say what Garfield has become on the internet is the most bizarre fandom I have ever encountered. And I'm not even talking about Garfield porn here, although yes, there is totally that as well. And yes, I did have to fuck up my Google Analytics to find these. No, I'm talking about things far more bizarre, which if you are not aware of, allow me to give you a little preview.
Oh my god.
Or
what?
slash Alzheimer's Group is a subreddit of 50,000 people reposting the same Garfield comic over and over and over. Each member role-playing like this is the first time they've seen it.
Oh my god.
Relax John is an 8-part animated series in which a morbidly depressed John Arbuckle is dragged into a frightening alternate reality as he is subsumed by a demonic Garfield. I'm sorry, John. Actually, Jesus, no, we're not ready for I'm sorry, John. But maybe in like an hour.
What is wrong with people, man? Oh my god, this is so weird.
And maybe you've noticed the runtime for this video and are asking, how could I possibly spend this much time on an idea
Does
that
seem bad, like.
the subtle lowering of my father's eyebrows as I explained it to him communicated to me was something he considered a profound waste of time.
Yes.
Oh god, I was meant to make a video about Berserk this year.
Wow. I mean, you still did.
I got lost. Lost.
Garfield.
Garfield. God, I hope it's worth it. But the answer is I have looked deep into Garfield.
Oh my
and
God.
I have seen things horrible, frightening, and beautiful, including what is to me, and I'm serious here, the greatest piece of fan art ever.
What? Is he being serious? This is so weird. This is about Garfield of all things. Jesus.
Created. And I would like to show it all to you. So join me on this long and strange journey as we take our first step and ask a question. How the fuck did we get here from a cartoon cat who likes lasagna? Or, to put it another way, what is Garfield?
Okay. He's
So,
a cat.
I want to be honest in that
Alright, was not expect that. Okay, was not expecting that.
Unlike the other fandoms I've covered for this channel, I've never really been that into Garfield.
Yeah.
That's not to say I dislike Garfield. It's just no, I'm not doing this. I do not need to humiliate myself for your amusement. That's not to say I dislike Garfield. Just that I was never really
I don't think I could have watched the whole thing with him wearing that. It would have been too distracting.
into him as a kid, and that hadn't changed up until this video. And so my first call was to go looking for articles on the appeal of Garfield. But what I found was kind of the opposite. Multiple headlines and videos about how Garfield is not funny and even was never
Supposed to be. Oh, right.
How Jim Davis is a marketing man first, and the comic was just intended as a vessel to sell merchandise. And after reading a lot of Garfield, and trust me,
Yeah, was it a lot?
I read a lot of Garfield. I actually disagree. I think this is a fairly cynical mischaracterization of Jim Davis and can be traced back to a single quote he gave 40 years ago, and is not really reflective of the dude of whom I have watched and read many, many interviews, who is the kind of person who still talks about wanting
One day
to
I'd
make
like to write
the
that
whole
gag that
world
makes the whole world laugh.
with a
Right,
simple
okay.
joke. But if I'm right about this, then why do so many people find Garfield unfunny? And that being the case, how has it survived for 40 years?
Yeah, like if people didn't like it,
I'm about to be very generous with my interpretation of Garfield, but I think it's important to do that because we need to understand the appeal here. And while I am not going to defend the comedy in Garfield, as we shall see later, I find 0.104% of Garfield comics funny. I do think, however, it's worth looking at the reasons why Garfield's humor gets such a polarizing reaction from people. Jim Davis's previous comic before Garfield was Norm the Gnat, which ended in 1975. He then spent 3 years doing, well, nothing before beginning Garfield in 1978. And to give that date a little context, that is not this decade, or the one before that, 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 but the one before that. Barring the old gods of media like Mickey Mouse and Peanuts, Garfield has been around longer than practically any relevant character in pop culture
that's
today.
mad, yeah.
And you can imagine this lazy, rude, anti-authority cat being a little more outrageous in the late 70s than he is today. In the same way The Simpsons and Sonic the Hedgehog would have seemed wild and countercultural in their day before slowly becoming mainstream, that's exactly what happened to Garfield. We are just not old enough to remember it. And Jim Davis has even talked about this in interviews. That said, I don't think the appeal of Garfield is its humor. I think it's Garfield. And what I mean by this is that we all want to be Garfield.
Oh God, where's this going? Yeah? Is that what it is?
Please don't click off the video, I promise I have a point to make here. Think of everything you consider imperfect about yourself. Physical, mental, emotional, whatever. Any perceived flaw that makes you feel shame. Now, imagine an alternate version of yourself where those flaws still existed, but you just accepted them. You are in perfect harmony with who and what you are, and that's it. And well, that's Garfield. Garfield is lazy, he's gluttonous, he's selfish, and people constantly make fun of him for being fat. But he doesn't give a shit.
He doesn't care.
He is perfectly content in who and what he is, and any of his perceived flaws are other people's problems,
And not his.
And that is some seriously aspirational levels of confidence. But the real genius of the character is he also has all these little traits that allow us to see ourselves in him. Garfield hates Mondays. He likes coffee. He loves lasagna. He dislikes spiders, loves to sleep, and resents authority. These are all very general, but what that means is that no matter who you are, there's probably something
you can
in
relate to,
Garfield
yeah.
you're going to be able to relate to.
Okay.
And that relatability, combined with his more aspirational quality, creates this simple but massively appealing cocktail of a character. And I think it's the strength of that appeal that's let Garfield survive for 40 years. And I just want to note here that for as messed up as things are going to get this video, there is a lot of really cool and wholesome Garfield fan art from people who just earnestly enjoy Garfield's comic and his world. One standout being the fan comic John, which tells the story of an older John Arbuckle rediscovering his love of art and cartooning, and it's just this super cute and endearing take on these characters. Now, granted, you don't have to spend that long looking for Garfield fan art on the internet before things start to get strange, like Garfamon, a blog
Pokemon that look like Garfield.
which one intrepid Garfield artist has been redrawing the entirety of Pokemon as Garfield.
I think that's kind of cool.
And I don't know how many there are because my browser crashes before I hit Gen 1. But what I think's really interesting about Garfamon is it shows how iconic and malleable Garfield's visual design is. Meaning Garfield's visual design is recognizable enough to be twisted into
anything.
Basically anything and still read as Garfield. This will become horrifyingly relevant later. But it's not just Garfield's character design
This
that
video's gonna
applies
get
to,
so weird.
but also the comic itself. Garfield's comic was a big part of his spread. Designed to be as simple, timeless, and consumable as possible, each one is entirely self-contained and rarely, if ever, touches off current events. And since even the early days of the internet and social media, people have been taking these comics and changing them. Something that's possible because of how simple a formula they work off.
Just the 3 panels,
Each comic following the same 3-panel structure. The first panel establishes the scenario. It is the morning and John and Garfield have just woken up. The second panel is the setup. Garfield is in an unusually good mood. And the third panel, the punchline. Garfield is in a good mood because he drinks too much coffee. With the exception of the longer Sunday comics, this is how Garfield works. And just like the character himself, that simplicity was critical in letting as wide an audience as possible understand and enjoy Garfield.
It's weird when I look at that. I'm reading it right to left because of how I read manga, and that's so strange, isn't it? That, like, obviously, like, it's meant to be left to right, so I'm glad he did it that way instead of having all 3 at the same time. But yeah.
But it's also that simplicity that made the comic so infinitely memeable. It is shockingly easy to make your own Garfield comic from splicing together different establishment, setup, and punchline panels. And you can even try this yourself with the random Garfield comic generators.
No way.
And it's that malleability that's led to scores of popular online trends, such as replacing the last panel of a Garfield comic with an image of Garfield smoking a pipe, and an unusual amount of these still work. But my personal favorite is the same, except the final panel now being Garfield being flung from a window. However, in time, people also got much weirder than that. For example, silent movie Garfield. Garfield with 1 extra beat panel. Garfish. Garfield with pixel art from that one really bad Garfield game that never released outside Japan. Garfield, but the drawing keeps getting lazier. Multiple choice Garfield. Garfield, except all the comics from 1978 are color averaged together. Real life Garfield. Uncomfortably close Garfield. Garfield devolves into noise. 2 Garfields. Polarized Garfield, you get the idea. So Garfield is this iconic, appealing character communicated through this simple but infinitely consumable and recreatable medium. And I think this does go a way in helping us understand the existence of something like r/Alzheimer's group. While there is something undeniably cruel about this subreddit, I'd be lying if I said I didn't think there wasn't something interesting and even a little poetic here. The idea that someone's final tether to their own reality is something as simple but recognizable as a Garfield comic strip. and the tragedy of when even that too starts to fade. However, this still doesn't take us any closer
my
to
God.
understanding why Garfield on the internet
That
is
is
so... you know. And I think a real easy answer
Get
here
shivers every time I say, oh God.
it's just the absurdity of making such depraved art out of something so simple and everyday. But as you may be able to tell from the remaining runtime on this video, I disagree.
Yeah.
I think there's genuinely something darker and stranger at play here, and I'm not even talking about the official Garfield's very occasional descent into something weirder. I'm talking about a darkness that lies at the heart of every Garfield comic strip. And to start to unravel what that is,
Okay.
I want to talk about the 28th of January 2008, when 27 very strange Garfield-themed videos all simultaneously appeared on a previously unknown YouTube channel.
What?
The kind of incredible thing about Lasagna Cat now is how weirdly ahead of its time it was. This was 2008, and the term meme was still years away from becoming something people actually said.
Huh.
And yet, Lasagna Cat made memes of Garfield comics, but then became memes of themselves before you had even finished watching the video.
Whoa.
And what I mean by this is that each video of Lasagna Cat is broken into 3 sections. The first is a live-action recreation of a Garfield comic. The second,
Okay.
the actual comic on which the first section was based. And the third, and by far strangest section, would take the footage of section 1 and change it. So this
Yeehaw!
would become this.
Yeehaw!
Music video parodies, video
Okay.
game references, 2008 internet humor. Lasagna Cat was taking Garfield comics and contorting them into all kinds of strange things, but
Wow.
tantalizingly, underneath the sheer wackiness of it all, there was what felt like a very subtle disdain towards Garfield. There was
Like a
something
hate.
a little grotesque and uncanny about these shrunken actors with their sagging costumes and human hands, each skit ending with the same canned droning laughter that nearly highlighted the mundanity of these jokes.
Garfield, this is a diagram of the food chain. You're here, and that's a mouse down there. Any questions?
Where's pizza?
But the strangest part was how each video ended on a bizarre tribute to Jim Davis.
Right.
This is one of the first really unusual things I noticed about the Garfield fandom.
Yo, what a tune. Balabo, let the rhythm take you over, Balabo. There.
It has this kind of feverish obsession with Garfield's creator, Jim Davis. And I say unusual because in every other fandom I've covered, I don't know if I remember a single instance of the creator of those properties ever appearing in fan works. But Garfield
He
is
does.
different.
Right.
Over and over, Davis kept materializing in fan works, often in very strange ways. And to the best of my knowledge, Lasagna Cat was the first instance of this happening. So, why?
Yeah.
Well, if that was a question you asked in 2008, you'd be waiting a long time for an answer.
Oh, but do we get one? Do we get an answer?
After the initial upload day of Lasagna Cat, the channel would go silent. Days would become weeks, weeks would become months, and months would become years. And without a single
weird,
update,
what?
Lasagna Cat began to fade into internet obscurity. Which is why it was such a shock when a full 9 years later, a new video appeared
What?
on the Lasagna Cat channel,
Oh, that is so strange. Wow, what?
ending with the text, Telephone Sex Survey, February 9th, 2017. This was the beginning of a strange rabbit hole of videos that led 2 weeks later to a bizarrely high production trailer that
What?
claimed if you called a toll-free number and left your name and the number of sexual partners you'd had, a Garfield web series would return. 2 weeks later, and boom. Just like they had 9 years ago, 11 new videos were simultaneously
so
uploaded
weird,
to
ugh.
Lasagna Cat. And while they were similar in format to the old videos, they were also so different. The first of the new videos begins as any typical Lasagna Cat would, parodying an old comic where Garfield steals John's pipe.
Okay.
But what's waiting for us at the end of the video isn't a re-splicing of the footage from section 1 that we're used to, but a man claiming that this simple Garfield comic transformed his entire existence as he obsessively analyzes every tiny part of the comic in excruciating detail, his examination gradually expanding outward to the immortal nature of art and mimetic culture and its ability to transcend humanity and even the laws of space and time. And this goes on for an entire hour, and it might
What?
just be the best video on the internet. And somehow,
That's crazy.
this was just the beginning. Whereas the original end of video skits had that charming amateur with a green screen feel, what waited for us in the third act
Whoa.
of these videos now were shockingly high production short films
Yo.
that transformed simple Garfield comics into these elaborate, surreal stories. Jokes about Odie getting a bag stuck on his head morphed into these strange tales of the bag-headed Odie becoming a fashion icon before taking his own life and being condemned by Garfield to a hell filled with demonic John Arbuckle chimeras. Gags where John uses the wrong shampoo would now be mutated into, well, this is what they would turn into, and I don't want to describe this. Those simple Garfield jokes were now being contorted to the bizarrest of extremes,
Yeah, whoa.
contrasting the arguable mundanity of the original with this just wild insanity. And even more pronounced this time was that subtle malice towards Garfield, each video still ending on those bizarre tributes to
Jim
Jim
Davis.
Davis. But it's only in the final video ever uploaded to the channel that Lasagna Cat would reveal what it truly was. And that video was called Sex Survey
Results. Whoa.
Sex Survey Results begins with John Arbuckle entering his living room and sitting down to read the paper. But he hears a knock on his door and...
Who's there?
to which he answers, revealing a strange white mannequin.
Okay.
The mannequin giving its name and number of sexual partners.
Hey, my name's Garrett Smith, and I have had exactly 0 sex partners.
Before the scene freeze frames and pulls out to reveal a near identical scene, and we begin again, but now with Garfield instead of John. The same events play out, only with a new piece of audio detailing someone else's name and number of sexual partners. And we cycle again, but now with Odie.
Okay.
And then again.
I like the
back
editing,
to
this is
John,
class, yeah.
And then again, and again, and again, and again, and again. And this continues for nearly 5 hours.
No, I thought he was going to say like 5 minutes or something. 5 hours? What the hell? What? Oh, I hope... What?
All of which I have watched, most of which I did live on stream.
Whoa.
Watching Sex Survey Results in its entirety is exhausting, an exercise in mind-numbing repetition. But I think there's something kind of important in that experience. You're listening to all these different recordings of people communicating what is, to many, a pretty sensitive piece of information. And it's weird and even a little uncomfortable. But soon, you just go numb to it. After an hour, it stops feeling weird. And after hours, it stops feeling like anything. Because anything repeated enough times loses all meaning. Not unlike a comic strip running day after day after day after day after day for 40 years. And it's at that point, when that feeling is at its strongest and you are completely numb to whatever is happening, that Lasagna Cat hits you with what has to be one of the most infamous and shocking pieces of footage that is allowed to exist on YouTube. At this point, the scene has descended into night. The mannequins have begun to take strange and grotesque
Yeah, I noticed that they
shapes,
started
and
looking
John
different.
answers the door one final time, only to be faced with
Himself.
John Arbuckle, 2. John Arbuckle, 0.
And immediately, this second John ages about 30 years.
Whoa.
This new, older John Arbuckle now wandering the streets alone, frightened and confused. He finds a dried out husk of a cat, which teleports him to a massive ravine, where he encounters a strange naked shaman who attacks him before teleporting behind him and whispering silent words in his ear.
This is so weird. What is this?
Before John collapses into a pile of worms and dirt. The shaman roars, and we hard cut to a young girl screaming in the bathroom of a public school. We're given extreme close-ups of her birthing a stillborn child, and she steps back and stares down in horror before saying something in Polish.
To dziecko nie jest moje. To dziecko jest coś z ciemności. Ja porodziłam ludzkie przekleństwo.
She leaves, and we get one final shot of the child, but now a ginger cat is perched beside it. We cut, the cat is now gone, and the baby opens its eyes before the screen is filled with a block of bright orange.
Well, that was
Well, I need to take a breath. What the hell? And that's, oh my god, that's Garfield based stuff. That is so dark. That is so weird. Like, okay, what's next?
nightmare. But I actually think that Lasagna Cat has something really interesting to say. But to get there, we're gonna have to do a little legwork.
Okay.
Earlier in this video, we asked, what
is Garfield? Yeah.
But now, I would like to ask, what is Garfield?
Yeah.
Considering I'd had little history with Garfield, I knew to answer this, I would need to immerse myself in him, to understand the comic on an intimate level. And so, I committed to reading 400 Garfield comics. But not just that, I wished to study them. And so, I didn't just read Garfield.
How long did this take to make, man? Because all the research ahead of time and all this, like, oh my god, this is insane.
I collected data on Garfield. I noted every observation I had in a large Google spreadsheet. And through this, I established that Garfield was made up of roughly 11 different kinds of jokes, such as humor derived from the fact that Garfield is lazy / gluttonous, absurdist humor, relatable humor, other humor, which were either recurring jokes too sporadic for their own category, but mainly jokes about Garfield doing things a cat would do, the joke being that he's a cat, or jokes about Garfield doing things a cat would not do, the joke being he's a cat. These are my least favorite kind of Garfield joke. I measured for a variety of variables, such as the amount of fourth wall breaks, which was 4, or instances of Garfield becoming suicidal, which was 2, or how many times the comic made me laugh, which was precisely once, and it was this one. After many hours of collecting Garfield data, I sought to answer a single question that would surely help me understand Garfield and by extension, Lasagna Cat. What was the most common type of joke in Garfield?
Yeah.
And when I tabulated the results, what I saw shook me. What was I looking at? This couldn't be possible. And I grew concerned. The 400 comics I had pulled from were a combination of every comic on the Twitter account Random Garfield,
Okay.
which algorithmically pulls 3 Random Garfield comics every day, as well as this YouTube video ranking the top 100 Garfield comics. Perhaps this video was a mistake, its author's biases tainting my study, so I proceeded to read 200 more Garfield comics, chosen completely at random from Garfield's web archive. I tallied the numbers again and no, impossible. This time the results were even more pronounced. Was I subconsciously selecting Garfield comics to affirm my own biases? I couldn't allow this. And so I committed to reading an entire year of Garfield, each month being selected from 3 and 4 year intervals across Garfield's 4 decades, bringing my total number of read Garfield comics to 956.
Jesus
But then
Christ.
I was struck with an idea. What if I committed to reading every Garfield comic in existence? Then my data would be pure, complete, and indisputable.
Oh my god, he's going
This
mad.
is when I encountered a problem. When I sought out the estimated total number of Garfield comics in existence, that number was 14,000! But how was there that many?
Whoa.
This video was already taking far too long.
Whoa.
And at this point, I'd already spent
14,200 and something comics. Jesus. I mean, they are just 3 panels, but still, that is a lot.
several days reading Garfield comics, and yet somehow I had only consumed 6.83% of all Garfields. For not the last time this video, the very concept of Garfield began to feel gargantuan and impossible, entirely beyond the grasp of my feeble mortal consciousness.
God.
I decided that reading 14,000 Garfield comics was not a realistic goal. I know some of you will consider this a failure. I am sorry. I read up on sample sizes and learned that my current yield of Garfield comics will leave me with a margin of error of about 1.5%, and this is widely considered acceptable. I sigh and proceed forward. I tally the final numbers and rank each strain of Garfield joke from 11 to 1. The results frighten me. I am now going to share this specific breakdown
what did you
with
find? Yeah.
because I need you to see what I see. Before we begin, I want you to ask yourself a question. What do you think is the most common type of joke in Garfield? And I want you to hold on to that guess as we proceed down the list. At number 11, we have jokes centered around Irma, the local cafe owner, and how she's bad at running her business.
Okay.
These jokes make up just 0.42% of Garfield.
Right.
Just above that, at number 10, with 0.5%, were jokes based around Garfield's girlfriend Arlene.
Oh, okay.
At number 9, with 1%, was humor derived from how much Garfield hates Nermal. At number 8, with 2.3%, is comedy conveying Garfield's hatred of spiders. At number 7, with 4.5%,
These are really low, so the higher up is going to be a larger percentage, isn't it?
was relatable humor. This was the first major surprise to me. I had assumed that a cat whose entire branding was built on one simple, relatable
hating
quote
Mondays
would have
like in
no
the sun, yeah.
relatable humor in its comic. I was wrong, and it wouldn't be the last
That
time.
is interesting.
At number 6, at 4.7%, was whimsy derived from Garfield's abuse of Odie. At number 5, with 13.7%, was mildly surreal and absurdist humor. At number 4, with 16.8%, are jokes based on Garfield being lazy or gluttonous.
Okay.
And again, for obvious reasons, I was shocked
Yeah, that's
not to
surprising.
see this further up the list.
Wow.
At number 3, with 17.4%, is other. These are the kinds of jokes I do not like. And at number 2, with 18.8%, is a mystery category that I will reveal much later in the video for dramatic effects.
Okay.
Now, before I unveil number 1, I want to stop and ask you again, what do you think is the most common type of joke in Garfield. At number 1, and by far the biggest shock on the list, was a category I never even would have guessed existed. And it's called John is Pathetic.
Oh.
John Arbuckle is 30 years old. He lives alone, has no real friends outside his dog and cat, and is constantly lonely. And these are all things that the Garfield comic takes joy in ridiculing. A typical John is Pathetic gag works like this. John says he's not going to call women for dates anymore, that he's going to wait for them to approach him.
Okay.
We see him waiting, and then we see him waiting what appears to be several months later. Jokes like this are very common, not just in how women find John actively repulsive, but in how he is pathetic and should be ridiculed.
Wow.
And you can see this in how the comic portrays his intelligence, his hobbies, his fashion sense, to even his physical strength and inadequacy in anything that could be considered remotely masculine. Across nearly 1,000 comics, I measured 0 cases of John showing any admirable qualities. Meaning, whereas Garfield is something to be aspired to, John is something to be laughed at.
Yeah.
Even when John did find a girlfriend in Liz 28 years into Garfield's run,
Jesus
and only
Christ.
after fans begged Jim Davis to end John's loneliness, he's still treated as this pathetic character. And I think there's something kind of sad about that. A person whose only purpose is to be ridiculed and to be trapped in that existence for 40 years.
That's a long time, Jesus
And where this
Christ.
gets even sadder is when you start to consider the comic from John's perspective.
Ooh. Ooh.
Across that same range of comics, I measured 156 instances of John displaying some kind of negative emotion or mental anguish.
Okay.
Anger, depression, lethargy. But if you're a casual reader of the comics, it might never feel like that. As whenever John does begin to sink into despair, Garfield is there to deliver a witty punchline and diffuse the tension. But here is where we start to get into the very strange nature of reality and Garfield. See, as the audience, as the readers of this comic, we can experience Garfield's thoughts through the visual device of thought bubbles. But critically, this is not the case for John.
Yeah, he's not hearing it, is he? Because obviously it's internal. So we're hearing this stuff. But, oh God.
Across every Garfield comic I read, I didn't record a single instance of John ever directly reacting to Garfield's thoughts in a way that couldn't be explained by him intuiting Garfield's body language and expression. And that information is critical because it means the reality we are experiencing and the one John
yeah.
is experiencing
Two different
are
things.
entirely different.
Yeah.
And this
Oh, this
brings
is
us
interesting.
to a question. What is it really like being John Arbuckle? On the 13th of February 2008, a Garfield fan comic was uploaded to Tumblr, and it looked just like a regular Garfield comic, but with one critical difference. The first panel depicted John sitting alone, with the dialogue, "I've done things in my life that I regret." The second panel shows nothing, just John, his remorseful silence unbroken. The final panel of the comic punctuated by nothing.
Wow.
Just a slight shift
Wow,
in John's
that's
expression,
weird.
like his regrets are washing over him. What this was just a regular Garfield strip with one key difference.
Oh.
Garfield had
Isn't
been
there?
moved. And because
And it's internal monologue anyway, so he would be by himself anyway in what he's
of the
hearing.
very specific way John and Garfield communicate, the comic still works. But whereas before Garfield's punchlines could distract us from John's misery, that's no longer the case.
Ah.
And this was the beginning of the bizarre
Whoa.
and morbid webcomic Garfield minus Garfield, which lets us experience the true crushing reality of John. And some of these comics are really haunting. There's one
yeah.
in particular
Ugh.
that is either very hopeful or very devastating, depending on your perspective, where John says, "We can't do anything about the past, but we can do something about the future. before he just disappears. Garfield minus Garfield was not the first instance of people
Whoa,
removing
yeah, this is
Garfield
really
from the comic
depressing,
to
man.
produce this kind of effect, but it was what popularized the idea online that there may be something very wrong with John Arbuckle. And over time, other fan works began to explore this in similar ways. Realistic Garfield, for example, conveyed similar themes by just replacing Garfield with a realistic cat who could not talk, as did fan comics like Arbuckle, while animations like Meat Canyon's Lasagna brought the idea of John's fractured reality even further, depicting John as a frightening, delusional lunatic who holds his terrified victims captive and forces them to play the part of Garfield and Odie.
Oh my god, that is so weird. No. Oh, what is wrong with people?
As he warps back and forth between the John Arbuckle we know from the comics and something much, much darker.
Right.
The reason all these pieces are important is that they show not only that there is something kinda wrong with John Arbuckle, but also that that is something that even in the early days of Garfield's online fandom, people picked up on. But where things get even stranger is when we look at this through the lens of what John Arbuckle was originally meant to be.
Oh, okay, cool.
Remember earlier when I said that Norm Nat ended in 1975?
And then the 3 year, right, okay, yeah, I was thinking about this. He put a big question mark, and then there was a second where he was on it. So I was thinking about this. I was wondering whether he's going to go back and actually go over the 3 years where he said he did nothing. What actually happened here?
Davis then spent 3 years doing nothing, and Garfield started in 1978. Well, that was a lie.
I thought
But
so.
I framed it this way because for decades, that's what people thought was the truth.
Yeah, but what actually
Listen to
happened?
any interview in which Jim Davis speaks about the origins of Garfield, and he'll wheel out the same anecdote about the failure of Norm Nat because insects are not appealing characters, and how that realization led to him looking at dog-centric comics like Peanuts and Marmaduke and saying to himself, what if I can create a similar character but for people who like cats?
Okay.
And thus, Garfield was born. Except this version of events also ignores the existence of Heathcliff, another surly, round, orange cat who predates Garfield by about 5 years, and this isn't relevant at all, but I just think it's funny. However, this telling is a lie, or at least not the full truth. Because you see, in the period between 1975 and 1978, there was a third comic, one that was only discovered in 2019 by intrepid Garfield historian Quentin Reviews, and this comic was simply titled John. There are two very strange things about John. The first being how closely it resembles Garfield. Everything from jokes to entire layouts are repeated across the two series, the only difference being that the main character here is John. Davis has spoken a lot about how John Arbuckle is an analog for him. Both grew up on a farm, both live in Muncie, Indiana, and both are cartoonists. In fact, Davis originally wanted to use the character of John as a way to voice his frustration with the comic strip industry.
Okay.
Which, if you look at where Davis was in his life when he first started writing this character, that tracks. John started just 2 weeks after the failure of Nat, and you can feel that frustration in these early comics. In one instance, John even turning to the camera and saying how he thinks the content of this comic will land him in trouble with parents groups. And while Garfield still featured heavily, there were strips where he just didn't appear at all,
Wasn't in
with
bold,
scenarios
right?
more focused on observational humor derived from the perspective of a single man. But it wasn't long into the run when that started to change, with jokes more and more centering around Garfield and not John. The final strip of John being published on August 8th, 1977, the strip returning a week later, but now
It's called Garfield. Right.
named Garfield. And within a year, Garfield would be syndicated on a national level, becoming the newer version of the comic we are all now familiar with. The second thing I find so strange about John is that while Jim Davis is often happy to laugh about the failure of Norm Nat, he barely ever speaks about
About
John.
John.
And when he does, he only talks about it in the vaguest of terms, as if it was an idea in his sketchbook as opposed to an actual published comic. And I can't help but wonder if there's something to that. If the idea of a comic that was meant to be his own perspective, his own outlet on life, was a failure, overtaken by a fictional character he created. Even stranger, as Garfield went on, the similarities between Jim Davis and John Arbuckle began to disappear. John's job as a cartoonist practically vanishing as he devolves into the pathetic shell of a man we now know. And I'm not saying here that I think Jim Davis has some deep-rooted trauma that is manifesting in his daily newspaper comic. I genuinely do not think that. But I do think that this perspective adds a lot to this strange meta-narrative of a man overtaken by his own creation, abandoning the character he once embodied, and that character now being trapped in a life of existential suffering. And here's the thing. If I was the only person who saw this, then there wouldn't be a story here. But I'm not. Let's go back to those last 5 minutes of Lasagna
Oh,
Cat.
right, okay, yeah.
Lasagna Cat ended 2 years before the discovery of John, but even then, what John adds to Lasagna Cat is kind of chilling. Like in that final scene, when that second John ages, he begins to bear a striking resemblance to Jim Davis, the person we now know John was originally meant to be.
Wow.
This new strange combination of Jim Davis and John Arbuckle, lost and clinging to the husk of a cat he should have let go of a long time ago. Before he comes face to face with a version of Garfield that's become independent from him and is now strange.
Oh, the
and
colours and
frightening.
everything, right, okay.
Before Davis crumbles to earth, outlived by the very thing he created, which is immediately followed by the bathroom scene. And what's interesting here is that if we translate the girl's monologue from Polish, it reads, "This child isn't mine. This child is from the darkness. I've given birth to humanity's curse.
Whoa.
My soul will be swallowed and vomited and swallowed again forever." Sick joke, but no one is laughing. My blood will remain. Death isn't the end. I am in hell. This is hell. And while I can't show it on screen, in that final shot, the baby is shown wearing a blue shirt identical to John
Oh my
Arbuckle's.
god.
For pieces of art like this, I think there is a lot of different interpretations that you can make. But for me personally, when Lasagna Cat is taken in totality, it becomes this bizarre statement on what happens when the things you create become more powerful than you.
Yeah.
How Garfield has become this semi-immortal entity, evolving past both John Arbuckle and Jim Davis. And I mean this literally. Garfield is no longer even created by just Jim Davis. He has an entire team of people working under him who've become so adept at creating Garfield, their work is now indistinguishable from his. And Davis has even spoken about selecting a replacement so that Garfield can continue long after he's gone.
Wow.
But here's the thing. It's not just Jim Davis's reality that Garfield has had this strange effect on. It's also ours. That might sound weird. I mean, how relevant could Garfield actually be in the modern era? Well, if I was to ask you which character out of Superman, Goku, and Garfield was the most syndicated, which would you pick?
Well, God. Well, it's going to be Garfield. It's going to be Garfield, but yeah.
And if you picked any answer other than Garfield, well, That was a strange choice given the subject of this video,
what I'm
but
talking
yeah,
about,
it is Garfield. After multiple decades in thousands of worldwide newspapers, Garfield has an estimated audience in the hundreds of millions.
Wow.
The New York Times had to change how its trade bestseller list was categorized after 7 of its 10 slots were occupied by Garfield.
Whoa.
And today, his merchandising sales are at an estimated $800 million to $1 billion, and that is a lot to sell in 40 years. Oh, wait, that's
Every
every
year?
That's every fucking year. In products that twist Garfield into every conceivable
Oh my
form you can
God.
imagine. For example, Garfield soap, Garfield air fresheners, Garfield cushions, Garfield
Why not?
teapots, a poster with Garfield as a ninja, Garfield headphone holders, Garfield thermostat, Garfield commemorative coin, Garfield digital alarm clock,
Whoa.
Garfield key hanger, Garfield piggy bank, Garfield Walkman, Garfield globe, Garfield ice skates, Garfield boxing gloves, how to insult your friends, Garfield book, Garfield web browser, Garfield amusement park ride, Garfield personal massager, a Garfield mug, another Garfield mug, a much dumber Garfield mug, a Garfield mug that is even dumber than the first dumb Garfield mug, existential Garfield, another existential Garfield, slightly too many Irish stereotype Garfield, Garfield waistcoat, unwell Garfield, Garfield gun, Satan Garfield, slime Garfield, child Garfield, illegal Garfield, another fucking Garfield mug, I don't know what this is, table Garfield, yet another table
What?
Garfield,
What?
Garfield prison tray, sex Garfield, far too large Garfield, nightmare Garfield, this horrifying bedsheet,
Oh,
the
whoa.
deeply cursed Garfield eats. What is this? Why? This Garfield jigsaw, which for some reason I can't quite pin down, puts the fear of God in me. In the mid-80s, a small coastal French village
Love
began
the
to
quick
suffer
cut.
an unusual phenomenon when plastic Garfield phones began washing up on shore.
What?
No one knew where they came from or why this was happening, but it continued for 3 decades, a mystery that was only solved in 2019 when the mysterious phones were traced back to a lost shipping container. We have so saturated
Oh my
this planet
God.
with Garfield merchandise that even the Earth herself has begun to reject it. But if that's the case, why don't we notice Garfield more? Why don't we see him everywhere in every day? And the answer is because they don't want us to. In the early 1980s, a production accident led to a Garfield plush with suction cups attached to its hands and feet. Paws Inc., the holding company for Garfield, didn't expect what was a botched product to sell well, which is why it
Yeah.
was such a shock when the toy was so popular, it led to a wave of car break-ins where radios and purses were left
People were
behind and
stealing
only
them.
the plush was stolen.
That's mental.
Sales climbing to a staggering $50 million. And what did Jim Davis and Paws Inc. do? We pulled all plush dolls off the shelves for 5 years. They didn't want Garfield to be a fad. They wanted to silently inject him into every part.
Wow, that's mad. Like, you could have just left them there and made all that money, but instead,
Where
wow.
he could hide in plain sight, silently growing into one of the most dominant fictional characters on the planet. And here's the thing, they succeeded.
Yeah.
What I'm about to tell you is not a joke. This is not some Space Jam 2-esque hijinks. This all happened over the course of making this video. An experience I call the Garfield phenomenon.
Okay.
It began in small ways. At first, I'd be watching a TV show and, oh, hey, there was Garfield. I'd look at Instagram and, my friends were posting about Garfield.
Okay.
And, oh, a text. I guess Chris Pratt
His
is
voice in
playing
Garfield.
Garfield in the new Garfield movie.
Yeah, yeah.
That's strange timing. Wait, why is Toby Fox talking about Garfield? And sexy goth Garfield began trending on Twitter? I began to feel slightly uneasy, so maybe I'll just try and relax and look at some gaming news. And oh, hey! I guess Garfield's the new character in that
Wow.
Smash Nickelodeon fighting game. isn't that grand? I'd been watching ReZero, which I did not like very much, and someone told me that Garfield appears in the second season, which just can't be true, and what the fuck?
Oh yeah, there is a character called Garfield, isn't there? And yeah, okay. That is weird, yeah.
A friend sent me a picture of a mural in an old house, and there was Garfield staring at me with what I can only describe as some kind of all-knowing contempt. I was now doing whatever I could not to think about Garfield, and I agreed to watch the first episode of the new Dexter with my partner, and...
Wow, yeah, I can only imagine. Brian wants to call him Garfield. I mean, who needs a dog?
What the fuck? What the fuck did he just say?
Calm down, calm down.
everywhere I looked, I saw Garfield.
So bizarre.
But why?
Oh.
Why was this happening now? Well, that answer would come to me, and it did so in the form of a phone call. Hello.
Hi, son.
Oh, hey, ma'am. How's it going?
John, I know you're working on your video of Garfield at the moment, so guess what? I found the picture of you with your Garfield.
Oh, ma'am, I don't think that was me. I was never actually that into Garfield.
Okay. Oh my god. This is so well put together.
So, earlier in this video, when I said that I was never into Garfield...
Turns out you were.
That was true. I don't remember this. I don't remember owning this massive Garfield doll, but that is me,
Okay.
and that is my mom, and this happened. I just don't remember.
Yeah.
And this is when it started to click. That when you look for Garfield, you begin to find him
Everywhere.
everywhere.
Yeah.
Even in the past.
That's weird.
This is the Garfield phenomenon. Garfield is all around us, and he always has been. We just never noticed. But my eyes are open, and now so are yours.
Yo.
If an alien race dug through a ruined Earth, they would think we worshipped Garfield, and they would be right. These are the three keys in unlocking what Garfield has become on the internet. A daily newspaper comic strip designed to be as simple and consumable as possible, but because of this becomes unintentionally malleable and recreatable, spreading edits of it online, one of which unknowingly touches off a bizarre meta-narrative of a man being overtaken by his own creation. That creation in time becoming an entity unto itself, one that has laid just outside the perception of man for 40 years and will remain there for infinitely more, transcending humanity itself. This is the bizarre modern reality of Garfield, and now that we understand it, we may enter the world of I'm Sorry, John.
I am so scared for what we're going to check out now. I'm not looking... Oh, I'm going to be so...
On October 22nd, 2013, a comic was uploaded to the internet that showed John Arbuckle awaking late one night. But something is wrong. Something is very wrong. His room is bathed in an eerie orange glow.
Yeah.
A strange material covering his walls, his furniture, and his entire home. He goes downstairs to try and discover the source of this problem, and upon entering the kitchen, he sees Garfield, his cat's strange swollen head bizarrely embedded in the wall, his skin spreading outward, covering every surface of his home.
I was so hungry.
As John realizes with horror, his entire home with him in it have been ingested by Garfield.
Oh my God.
I'm sorry, John.
This was the beginning, and in the years to follow, more and more strange and frightening depictions of Garfield would begin to appear on the internet. Comics that looked normal at first, only to take disturbing turns, with Garfield often portrayed as something alien and unknowable, one of the most popular of which was 2017's Gramfell, a darkly humorous webcomic whose early pages were focused on John's depression, met by an uncaring, nihilistic Gramfell. But as the comic continued, Gramfell began to reveal to John not only the inherent unhappiness of life, but the futility of his existence as a character trapped in a webcomic, breaking John down to his core components and trapping him in strange and surreal realities over and over. At one point, even transforming the very webcomic of Gramfell itself into a different series called Jan and Gram, in which John gets to live out the cute and peaceful life he's always wanted before John is ripped from his serene dream and in the final page is forced to acknowledge that he is alone, and he always will be. What I find so fascinating about Gramfell is it's that same dynamic of John and Garfield, just brought to a cosmically nihilistic extreme. This was the core concept of what would inform everything that was to come. But notably, Gramfell never felt truly frightening or disturbing because of the simple pastel cuteness of its aesthetic. And if the horror of Garfield on the internet was going to truly solidify, it needed an aesthetic. And in the following year, it would get it. In 2018, an image would be uploaded to Instagram from horror artist Will Burke.
Oh, mate. That is weird. Oh.
One that depicted a horrifyingly bloated Garfield clutching a tiny, frightened John with the text,
John, I require lasagna.
Something about this image resonated with people, and it became wildly popular online, becoming the first in a series of 5 illustrations, each one depicting Garfield as a grotesque, swollen monstrosity, his form swimming between heaving mounds of flesh and sharp insect-like appendages.
I wonder what Jim Davis thinks of these. Does he touch on? I wonder if he touches on that in this video. Like, if Jim Davis has seen these things, what his thoughts are on it.
As he hunted John through his home, and while the sheer horror of seeing Garfield twisted into such nightmarish forms were a huge part of the power of these images, critically, they also captured the kind of hopelessness of the character of John Arbuckle, but channeled it into pure horror. One illustration showing John terrified and clutching a shotgun as a grotesque centipede-like Garfield emerges through the door behind him, with text that reads,
Bullets don't work, John.
The final image of this series depicting a gargantuan Garfield now towering over a helpless, terrified John as he whispers,
The world is going to end, John.
These images would rampage across the internet, being posted, reposted, and upvoted tens of thousands of times, and would become the blueprint for everything Garfield would become online. As different artists began to create their own interpretations of Burke's work, such as animator Lumpy Touch, who took Burke's illustrations and reimagined them through stunning and horrifying pixel art animations, not only giving these still images a new horrifying dimension through movements, but also reframing them as a 2D survival horror video game. Lumpy Touch taking this concept even further later on, with both a first-person exploration recreation of the original I'm Sorry John comic.
Oh my god, oh wow, yeah, wow.
As well as creating a tutorial for his own fake Garfield survival horror game in which the player is hunted by one of 13 Gorefields, all based on the different zodiac signs. And what I really love about this is you can see that kind of existential horror introduced by Gramfell, as well as the more grotesque body horror introduced by Burke, now being spliced with other mediums and genres of horror, and you could see this continue to evolve in other illustrations like those of artist Omega Black, who took the idea of Garfield horror and introduced a cosmic eldritch feel, like this image in which Garfield states,
"I no longer require eyes, John."
Which I am pretty sure is a reference to the 1997 film Event Horizon, a sci-fi horror in which a group of astronauts board a lost starship that has returned from hell, featuring the infamous line,
"Where we're going, we won't need eyes to see."
Omega Black's other illustrations only expanding on this Lovecraftian style of Garfield horror, with a grotesque centipede-like Garfield stating,
"Heaven is a void of light, John."
Or John being held captive by cloaked Oddies before an impossibly massive multi-armed Garfield booms,
"I'm eternal, John."
It's very berserk-esque, isn't it?
Each new piece of Garfield fan art added to this idea of Garfield as a cosmic, horrifying being, sometimes referred to as Creepy Garfield or Gorefield. And this is what led to October 8th, 2018, and the creation of the subreddit
I'm sorry,
I'm sorry, John. There's nearly a cult-like feel to I'm Sorry, John. Its title plaque reading, "Garfield has abandoned his limited form and he is beautiful. Surrender yourself to him and be saved."
Oh, that is very culty, isn't it? Like, this... I didn't realize there's so much darkness around Garfield. This is so bizarre.
This is a community of nearly 800,000 people dedicated to bringing to life this new version of Garfield the internet has created, as well as his infinite torment of John Arbuckle. And maybe, like I did, you're thinking, no, Garfield's not evil. He's not trying to hurt John. It's not like that mystery number 2 category of Garfield joke.
Yeah, what was that?
Joke is in fact humor based off Garfield's torment of John.
Okay, this makes sense.
But that's right. At 18.8%, nearly 1 in 5 Garfield jokes center around Garfield causing John mental anguish.
Right, okay.
And it's not just that. Another variable I measured for was the amount of times Garfield showed empathy towards John or tried to comfort his suffering in any way. And across nearly 1,000 comics, that number was 0.
Whoa.
So,
Whoa.
in the same way Garfield minus Garfield reveals something real, if unintentional, about Garfield, the same is true in I'm Sorry, John. Garfield has always been about a person trapped with a cold, nihilistic being that torments him.
Wow.
And it's been that way for 40
yes,
years.
very beginning. Wow.
/I'm Sorry John does is bring that concept to a horrifying extreme.
Yeah.
This is the reason I think so many pieces on I'm Sorry John have this odd kind of power to them. Their horror is rooted in being trapped with something awful and inescapable. But what's really fascinating about the horror of I'm Sorry John is how different artists have approached this idea in different ways. I like categorizing things, so I've identified what I think are 3 basic kinds of horror on I'm Sorry John. The first being physical Garfield horror. These are pieces that twist Garfield into strange and frightening creatures, sometimes into amalgamations of unsettling body horror, but more often swelling Garfield to such nightmarish proportions that there is no chance of John ever defeating, escaping, or even surviving these grotesque beasts Garfield has become. And what's interesting here is how many of these pieces evoke or even directly reference the FromSoft games Dark Souls and Bloodborne, which themselves create a lot of their horror and emotion by forcing you into battles with these massive and horrifying creatures that feel impossible to overcome. It's that kind of physical hopelessness that these pieces create. And just like those games, the more extreme examples of this kind of Garfield horror carry a cosmic, nearly Lovecraftian feel, as Garfield is now so large, so impossible, that he begins to feel like some kind of terrible deity, a being of such immense power and scale that it throws into chaos our own sense of humanity's place in the universe, whether we really are the dominant species we've always assumed, or just dust in the wake of something much greater. I just read that line and I can't believe we're talking about fucking Garfield.
Yeah, that's mad. We need to take a step back every time and realize we are talking about Garfield here. This is absolutely insane.
Of Garfield horror is more intimate and psychological. Here, it's less that Garfield is a physical threat as much as it is the subtle, insidious damage he's doing to John's mental state, sometimes in the form of an awful, malicious creature who constantly follows John and goads him, driving him to do terrible things, but sometimes as a delusional presence in John's own mind, a manifestation of his internal struggles, be they depression, addiction, or worse, in a way that feels similar to your Shinings, your Silent Hills, or reading your own comment section. These pieces are much rarer, but what I think's awesome about them is how they take that bleakness that's always been a part of John's character and express it through Garfield. There is a third type of Garfield horror, and these are my personal favorite. Posts that focus on a more existential form of terror. The simplest examples of this are pieces that trap John in these impossible and infinite liminal spaces where there is no escape and he will forever be haunted by Garfield. But other scenarios are more elaborate, like when even death itself can't release John from Garfield's grasp, showing Garfield as this immortal, unending being who will always return to plague John, or even the opposite, like in this one comic where John takes his own life to escape Garfield, only to be brought back to life by him so his suffering can continue. Other pieces are stranger and even more abstract, like showing Garfield as these grotesque physical parasites that have attached themselves to John and are feeding off him, while he is trapped in these strange, unending dream worlds. And I think where this particular kind of horror gets really powerful is when it's combined with the more psychological type of Garfield horror we just talked about, like Lumpy Touch's Relax John, which we mentioned earlier. And what I think is so great about this animation is it shows John returning home late one night at his most broken, his life now destroyed, having lost his job, Liz, and even Odie. And it's at this point, when he's at his absolute lowest, that he is most vulnerable to a being like Garfield, who offers John an escape from his miserable existence in the form of comfort, but in reality drags him into a frightening nightmare. And I love this so much because it is such a fantastic example of what Garfield has become on the internet. Garfield is despair. He's the part of John that makes him feel weak and insignificant, who pulls him down and traps him in realities dark and frightening. That is the core horror of Garfield and I'm Sorry, John. It's interesting to note that this concept has only continued to evolve online, in sub-communities like You're Welcome, John, which is a more wholesome, if still very disturbing, relationship between John and a cosmically nightmarish Garfield, as well as I'm Really Sorry, John, which I cannot even talk about if this video has any hope of staying monetized.
Right, oh god, it gets worse, yeah.
This video is nearly definitely going to be demonetized, and so I have a Patreon. There's one tier, it's $1, so yeah. But hey, look, either way, I appreciate you watching. You can even see this very defined kind of Garfield horror being transplanted onto other fictional series, with I'm Sorry John's occasional non-Garfield weekends. And while I really love these pieces...
Ernie, how do I look? With your eyes, Bert. With your eyes.
God, that's so good. I think it's interesting how, at least to me, they never quite carry the same level of impact or meaning as those based on Garfield. Not only because of how deeply rooted the horror of I'm Sorry, John is in the very core of Garfield, but also in how, when taken with everything else we've talked about today, these pieces begin to transform what these characters are, and in particular, John Arbuckle. When I started this video, all John was this schlubby dude, but over time, that started to change. I watched him go from this character with a very defined purpose and reason for existing to someone who loses that purpose and becomes to the world around them a pathetic joke. And it's like that experience causes this deep emptiness to well up inside them, a despair that makes life feel meaningless and impossible in a way that the Garfield comic can barely contain, till one day that despair begins to manifest as Garfield, an entity that traps John in this deep and horrifying delusion, warping every part of his reality. This entity, with each passing day, growing stronger and more frightening as John falls deeper into despair. And when I think of this late stage of John's existence, there's one artist in particular that comes to mind.
Oh yeah, didn't he say that at the very start he saw like the best fan art he has ever seen, and he's going to show it in this?
Part of what makes Rajam's work so powerful and frightening is how intimately they seem to understand each particular kind of Garfield horror. Some pieces show Garfield as these massive, monstrous beasts whose mere existence conveys this horrifying physical futility. Others show Garfield as this gargantuan and grotesque parasite, as this insidious force that's been with John since the moment he was born, and for years has manipulated and contorted every part of his life, draining John, until finally Garfield has grown so powerful that he's now more a god than anything else, so infinite, cosmic, and terrifying that he's become John's entire reality. And John, now just a speck of dust, hopeless and terrified in the face of this thing that he created till the end of time.
And I think there's something really powerful about these images. The beautiful thing about horror is it lets us externalize the things that haunt us. And when I look at the work of Omega Black or Lumpy Touch or Rajam, what I see is a person struggling. Someone whose existence stopped making sense a long time ago and who's just trapped in this horrifying distortion of what their life should be. And I think there's something very human about that. When I think back to the very worst periods of my life, what comes to me is this feeling of being trapped in my own mind.
He's wearing the suit again.
That there is something in me that is distorting how I see the world and the people around me and everything, and it's horrible. It's a nightmare. And I think the hardest part of it is the feeling that it's never going to end, that the way you feel in those moments is how you will feel for the rest of your life. And if you've ever struggled mentally or emotionally, you know that fear. And it is that fear that I've never seen visualized better than in fucking Garfield fan art.
It's crazy.
We all want to be Garfield, but we all are John Arbuckle. And the thing is, those bad times, they do never last. They do end. And I think that's why I find this final piece so hopeful. The piece is done in Rajam's traditional pen and ink style, but with a subtlety that makes it feel nearly carved from stone. And it shows a demonic Garfield lying, defeated and broken, a sandaled foot pinning him to the ground, which belongs
to John?
To an angelic John Arbuckle.
Huh.
Tears rolling down his face, his wings raised in this just glorious arc. And it's like, after everything we've watched John go through, after all the loneliness, the depression, the complete loss of his identity, leading to the dissolution of his reality into this infinite, abject nightmare, after all that, somehow, he's made it to this moment. He's taken his life back from the shit that haunts him, and it's fucking beautiful.
Yeah.
And maybe this won't last. Maybe there's still darker times ahead. But it doesn't matter. Because in this moment, he's okay. John's okay. And look, I get it. I get that having this strong an emotional reaction to what is most certainly a Garfield shitpost is ridiculous. But goddamn, that is what I do here. I take my hope where I can get it. The title of this piece being The Forgiveness of John. Oh,
wow.
I put the
costume
back on because I was worried that this part might be too heavy.
So you wanted to like,
it.
a little bit of lightheartedness to it.
And also I paid a lot of money for it. What makes The Forgiveness of John so powerful to me is that in isolation, it is an amazing piece of art and a real technical achievement. But when taken with everything else we've spoken about this video, it becomes the concluding chapter of a gigantic meta-narrative that is formed around John Arbuckle. And again, if I was the only person who saw that, there wouldn't be a story here. The Forgiveness of John being the third most popular post on r/I'mSorryJohn of all time,
right,
as well as adorning its front page. And I think it's awesome that so many people's individual works come together to pull such an incredible story. And I really hope you enjoyed this video.
I did. I was not expecting that at all. That was so interesting.
Give a huge thank you to artist Lumpy Touch, who did the incredible thumbnail for this video.
Ah, cool.
Lumpy Touch has so much awesome shit that I didn't even get to touch on this video, so be sure to check out their YouTube channel and follow them at Lumpy Touch on Twitter. I also really want to thank both Quinton Reviews and Izzy Is, both of whom laid some serious groundwork for this video, as well as giving me some fantastic leads. So
wow, that's JoJo's stuff, isn't it? Cool. So that's Kira and another one bites the dust. Oh, what was his stand called? It was that, wasn't it?
So thank you guys. If you would like to help me make more videos like this, head on over to patreon.com/super-eyepatchwolf, where for just a $1 you can help me make more of, well, whatever this was. Thank you this week to Wen Tay Dao, and I just want to immediately apologize.
Hope that's how it's pronounced, yeah.
Apologize for my pronunciation of that name. Chelsea, Cyanide House,
wow.
Augusta Wickman,
Bubbly Chica, Emmanuel Paredes, and Fang Slime. Find me as ever hosting the Let's Fight a Boss video game podcast on Twitter at iPatchWolf or on twitch.tv/Super iPatchWolf. Friends, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.
Wow. Wow. What a video. Can't believe I put it off for so long. But like I said, the way I record stuff now, it's a lot easier to do longer videos. So, yeah, never thought I would be getting into such a weird, like, deep dive into what is Garfield. But that was so well put together. That was really interesting. And, yeah, there you go. Make sure you check out my Etsy shop, links in the description there. T-shirts and hoodies that I've designed are there to be purchased. And thank you to my patrons. If you want to have your name at the end of every video I upload, link in the description to the Patreon page. $1 a month is all I ask to put the channel. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you guys for that. Thank you all for watching. What do you guys think of that? What do you guys think of this? Click like, subscribe if you haven't already. Leave comments down below. Let me know what I should watch, discuss in future videos. And I will see you guys, all you guys, next time.